JZ， 感谢如是我闻，感谢我是 ZZ， 感谢杨天，感谢以上各位观众对我们的打赏。在华尔街论坛直播的最后的这个末尾呢，我们也会给大家带来华尔街联报，给大家讲述一下过去一段时间发生在中国内外一些热点事件，或者是这个焦点新闻的各种解读。那么我是小杨，这是何必先生，我们在下个礼拜跟大家不见不散。
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。泰国和马来西亚同意将两国共同边界转为贸易区，造福两国人民。泰国新首相斯雷塔与马来西亚首相安华举行会谈后，在联合记者会上透露，两人讨论了马国北部和泰国北部的国防安全课题，并同意把共同边界的小型战区转变成贸易区，为两国人民带来繁荣兴盛。这也符合两国贸易和电子商务量的增长趋势。那马来西亚和泰国同意成立特别工作组，以促进农业、旅游、贸易、商业，包括清真和安全领域的双边合作。马来西亚首相拿督斯里安华就说，他与泰国首相斯雷塔在双边会议上达成一致的共识。安华指出，两国同意在1个月内再次举行会议，以评估和了解工作组的进展。安华在会后的记者会上就表示，特别小组的相关报告需要在1个月内完成，以确保其执行顺利有效。安华就说，当马来西亚和泰国同意在相关领域建立多个工作组时，这在务实的讨论中非常罕见。安华相信，基于泰国首相斯雷塔在企业领域的表现和他的认真态度，这件事情是能够实现的。我们交换意见，以确保它能够得到有效的实施。那安华也表示，他真诚希望马泰之间的良好关系能够进一步改善双边贸易和投资，使两国都受益。同时，会议也还讨论了汽车公司吉利和宝腾希望在泰国开设电动汽车 Electronic Vehicle 工厂的意向。安华就说，考虑到泰国在相关行业的丰富经验，他要求该公司与泰国首相进行讨论。那与此同时，斯雷塔在同一场新闻发布会上对这一愿望表示欢迎，并准备就此事进行深入讨论。中国浙江吉利汽车集团与宝腾成立的联营公司，有意到泰国建设电动车组装厂，以进军当地电动车市场。不过，安华并没有透露具体详情，包括有关联营公司的名字。那安华就说，他们希望在泰国设立一座电动汽车工厂。那马国政府将与吉利和宝腾举行一次会议，希望能制定明确的下一步措施，并尽快推行。那安华也表示，他已经向斯雷塔提出有关吉利与宝腾成立联营公司，有意在泰国设厂的计划，相信泰国电动车领域的高速发展可以让该公司受益。但截至目前为止，安华还不清楚这个计划是否与宝腾旗下公司 Pronet 代理经营的 Smart 有关。那去年开始，宝腾旗下经销部门 Proton Ada 受委为 Smart 汽车对大马和泰国的进口、分销和代理商，故而成立了新的全资子公司 Pronet。Smart 汽车是由 Daimler 集团与吉利集团共同持股。上个月，宝腾也在中国南宁与 Smart 签署了合作备忘录 MOA， 双方将会共同探讨在宝腾与马来西亚霹雳州汽车生产线组装 Smart 品牌电动车的可能性。马来西亚游客位居泰国外国游客总量首位。而另一方面，根据泰国媒体的报道，2023年上半年共有1280万外国游客到访泰国旅游，其中马来西亚游客人数位居第一。中国游客数量未达到预期的1/3。根据泰国国家旅游局的最新数据就显示，今年前6个月入境泰国的游客人数达到1287万4999人次，其中马来西亚游客数量最多，达到206万7077人，其次是中国游客144万2475人次，韩国游客76万2599人次， 印度游客757611人次，越南游客509505人次，俄罗斯游客509505人次。那在6月份单月入境人数方面，前5个国家的外国游客分别是马来西亚游客377719人次，中国游客311244人次，印度游客152648人次，韩国游客121798人次。根据旅游与体育部的统计数据和预测，随着东南亚、东亚和欧洲等地区的暑假期间，泰国旅游业呈现出良好的发展趋势，并有望达到泰国国家旅游局设立的2023年度外国游客赴泰旅游人数2500至3000万人次的目标。然而，由于目前国际旅行经济形势不佳，以及中国南海地缘政治冲突和俄乌冲突升级的不确定性因素，泰国旅游业仍然面临一定程度的影响。数字化转型，东盟加强推动地区内支付互联互通。另一方面，东盟成员国领导人推动地区内支付互联互通，促进本币交易。根据各项研究结果指出，东盟蓬勃发展的数字支付市场预计到2030年交易额将达到2万亿美元。东盟国家在连接区域支付和促进使用本币方面取得了重大的进展。印度尼西亚、新加坡、马来西亚、泰国和菲律宾早前签署了一份谅解备忘录，优先考虑跨境支付系统、本币支付框架、数字支付平台和包容性金融。此外，未来柬埔寨、印度尼西亚、老挝、马来西亚、缅甸、菲律宾、新加坡、泰国和越南等国家已经实施了基于东盟指南的双边本币支付框架。越南国家银行和泰国银行联合推出了跨境交易二维码支付服务。印尼央行与新加坡金融管理局也合作开展跨境二维码支付联动，进一步加强东盟支付互联互通。东盟领导人还同意促进区内跨境交易使用本币，此举旨在减少对主要国际货币的依赖，增强金融稳定，并且避免全球危机的潜在溢出效应。为促进区内支付互联互通，东盟领导人于2023年5月成立负责研究东盟本币交易框架的可行性、利益、挑战和实施方法的工作组。该组预计将在2024年底前提交报告和框架草案。马来西亚力争成为地区能源转型的领头羊。马来西亚已为成为地区能源转型和可再生能源的领先国家做好了充分的准备。该国已经实施氢能经济和科技路线图 HETR 和国家能源转型路线图 NETR。马来西亚首相安华和该国副首相法迪拉尤索夫在2023年马来西亚国际绿色技术与生态产品展览和会议 ICEM 2023上表示，氢能经济和科技路线图到2030年可带来约25亿美元的营业收入。此外，实施氢能经济和科技路线图预计将创造 4.5 万个就业机会，共有6个杠杆和5个辅助因素的国家能源转型路线图预计将把该国 GDP 从2023年的250亿令吉提升至2050年的2200亿令吉，和创造31万个就业机会。成功展开该战略将允许马来西亚参与全球绿氢市场，预计到2050年价值至少达到1891.9亿美元。安华就表示，马来西亚已经获得世界经济论坛承认为东南亚2023年能源转型指数排名最好的国家，其表明马来西亚在推动战略变化和经济结构调整转向新增长领域中正朝着正确的方向发展。然而，安华认为财政成为该国到2050年实现净零排放目标的真正挑战。根据估计，从2030年至2050年阶段，该国需要投资至少 1.2 万亿令吉来创造有责任的能源转型过程。尽管如此，安华强调，政府承诺过到2050年达到可再生能源发电装机容量达 70% 以上，是地区最雄心的目标之一。他同时表示，相信该积极和进步的目标将促进马来西亚发展成为绿色和清洁投资的便利目的地，从而保持甚至为该国创造新的经济机会和就业岗位。谢谢大家，这就是本期的亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见，留言在节目下方。
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度借一篇成为中国互联网热点话题的讨伐姚明的檄文，关注习近平的下个反腐方向。前段时间在2023年篮球世界杯赛中，中国男篮是战绩不佳，连续第2次是无缘奥运会。那在杭州亚运会上，中国男篮也未能实现卫冕这个亚运金牌的目标。尤其是2度输给了菲律宾，网民在诧异中中国男篮国足化的同时质疑中国篮协主席姚明的声音也是此起彼伏。在10月6日的时候，中国篮协主席姚明接受了一个新华社记者的独家专访，当时他是对一些热点问题进行了回应。当被记者问及作为中国篮协主席需要承担什么样的责任时，姚明回答他认为有2种办法可以承担责任。第一种，承担过去的责任，辞职回家，上海离这儿反正也挺近。第2种是承担责任的办法，就是把这些东西积累下来，分析出来，设计出下一步的行动计划。2种办法，姚明说他都能接受。本身在中国男篮世界杯惨败，亚运会仅获铜牌之后，关于中国篮协主席姚明是否应该下课，就引发了极大的热议。在上面这个采访出来之后，围绕姚明会不会辞职，在中国互联网上也有很多的讨论。随即中国篮球评论员杨毅在他的最新节目中就说，姚明是带着尚方宝剑空降的，姚明是得到了前所未有的支持。杨毅说辞职不辞职，没人能够代表姚主席，他自己拿主意。从我对这个事的了解，我觉得姚主席不会，也不能，也不可能辞职，也不可能被辞职，不可能被拿下。我相信他会干完这一届任期，而且我也是支持姚主席继续干，因为在中国，只有姚明坐在这个位置上的时候，他有这个能量去干这件事。就这些年大姚所做的这些尝试，他调动的体育领域内的包括社会各方面的力量，动用的体育领域和社会各方面的资源，是没有人敢不配合的。包括他指定任何人去做事，去做事的方式，没有人能够提出异议。所以你要说姚主席他还得不到支持，这话我相信所有业内朋友都同意我说的，那您就非常亏心了。从体育到各层面能支持的都已经支持，但是您要说在中国篮协的内部，一个空降的领导，他是不是能理顺各方面的关系，把各个部门的力量都调动起来，这要是体现个人领导能力的时候，这个事就难说了。但我还是支持姚主席继续干，没有任何人有姚主席这样的社会影响力，没有人像姚主席一样腰间悬着尚方宝剑。换一个人在这儿，不可能从上层社会各方面获得那么多的资源和支持，这是姚主席独有的，换了人可能根本是玩不转了，也没这个机遇。只有姚主席能玩，但他能不能把这事玩转，是姚主席面临的挑战。上面的言论一出激起更大的讨论。可能屏幕前的很多观众跟我一样，对于姚明的认识，还是他在一个球员他从这个上海的 CBA 一路打进 NBA， 那再在这个2008年的这个北京奥运会上出尽了风头，随后是急流勇退，选择退役。那在姚明这个放弃运动员的身份，转而从事当官之后可能很多朋友跟我一样，也是对姚明的关注也逐渐下降了。此次这个姚明被称呼空降到领导的位置，还带着尚方宝剑，不得不说让大家都觉得已经不认识姚明了。最后在微博上，一个 ID 名为南音之音的用户就杨毅的这番评论追加一篇长文，提到作为运动员出身的姚明，何源能够成为手持尚方宝剑的顾命大臣，还需要从申办2022年冬奥会说起。在2015年，中国开始冬奥会的筹备工作，在申奥大使一栏借鉴2001年申办北京奥运会王治郅出任申奥大使带来的社会影响力，时任国务院的副总理，负责教育与体育事务的刘延东女士同意了姚明成为代表团成员，为申办冬奥会出力。也就是同年的年底，姚明与其他团队开始在体育行业布局，并多次找到留办工作人员，希望得到领导的举荐。本着让年轻人试一试的想法，那这个 ID 的 作者的极大校友对姚明成为篮协主席这件事向总局领导层面传递了这一信号。而为了推动这一事宜，之前就有良好媒体关系的姚支队就在舆论上是推波助澜。新任国家体育总局局长苟仲文借坡下驴，给了姚明成为篮协主席的机会，这就是所谓的尚方宝剑。这篇长文还提到，说到体育腐败，在今年年初新疆的这个 CBA 俱乐部提出的姚明与其经纪团队之间存在的利益输出、利益勾结，甚至是利益绑定，已在国内外形成巨大影响。中国篮协作为具有官方背景的体育组织，行使政府职能的同时，也应该严格遵守政府职能部门的纪律要求与法律法规。而在新疆控诉姚明的公开信中，我们看到新疆广汇男篮对于姚明与布浩众辉体育公司的利益勾结，同时反映了相关利益输送与以权谋私的重大违规行为。那么一直关注中国体育的这个体育记者马克·德雷尔也注意到了这篇长文，他读完之后认为姚明可能会遇到麻烦。他认为这篇文章中提到尚方宝剑，这表明姚明迄今为止受到了上面的保护，但考虑到体育行业持续不断的腐败反腐运动，其含义非常明显，姚明可能是下一个目标。那姚明会是下一个目标吗？目前中国的反腐运动似乎是有了新的方向。综合中国官媒和南华早报的报道，在对金融、体育和医疗行业进行了长达数月的严打之后，中国是又开始新一轮的腐败检查，以寻找潜在的重大风险。中国最高反腐机构中央纪委的负责人李希表示，中纪委将在针对5个政府部门和26家国有企业的巡视中深入调查。中纪委在这周2的会议后公布了目标清单，显示重点将放在包括科技领域。这5个部门包括科学技术部、工业和信息化部、国有资产监督管理委员会、国家国防科技工业局和国家烟草专卖局，汽车、钢铁和航空航运、出版业的国有企业也在调查范围之内。你看到这个新的方向是不包含体育的，但今年3月至9月的最近一次打击行动针对的包括体育，包括的是金融、体育和医疗行业。有140多名国有企业官员是被拘留接受调查，今年至少有36名的副部级以上高级干部受到调查，并且有人发现2023年发生的体育界反腐事件与2014年发生的一系列涉及体育管理者的逮捕事件是极为相似。那么为什么中国有如此之多的体育的高层领导被卷入腐败的阴谋呢？南华早报在9月底有一篇报道就提到，引述撰写了多位关于中国体育的书籍的作者罗伯特·韩，他认为这种明显的历史重演反映出体育系统中顽固的权力结构、有效监督的缺失以及治理的失败。他认为腐败意味着对权力的制约和管理失灵，除非改变体育的权力结构，否则它所产生的结果将一成不变，一而再再而三的发生。一般而言，中国实行高度集中和政府控制的国家体育体制，最高层是国家体育总局，其下属的单项体育管理机构通常也是各国家体育协会，负责监督资金、运动员的培养、国家队和比赛以及公众参与和商业推广，而省级和地方体育局以及体育学校和体育学院网络为这些提供支持。这个体系以取得国际体育赛事的成功为中心，在某些方面是发挥了作用，使中国成为多个奥运项目的强国。但这一体制在过去几十年是受到广泛的批评，因为它是一种以奖牌为导向的理念，忽视了基层对于体育运动的参与，也滋生了一些问题，比如资源分配缺乏透明度，导致裙带关系和腐败。那为了解决这些问题，中国的体育总局在过去10年中对某些体育项目进行了以市场为导向的体制改革，其中最大的改革是在足球领域将运营与行政管理分离开来。为了提高足球运动的透明度，体育总局的足球管理机构被撤销，一个中国的足协成为了一个独立的法人实体。中国足协剥离了职业联赛公司，并于2017年开始发布由外部会计师审计的年度财务报告。然而，这些改革仍未能遏制腐败，而与此同时对体育运动投资的增加可能也会成倍增加贪污腐败的收益。韩说由于市场经济及其产生的财物也同样处于集中的权力之下，那拥有权力的人总是可以追求寻租。 北京一家体育研究机构的研究员程一文则认为，目前中国体育系统的反腐有2种方式，一种是行业内部自律，二是外部监督，如中纪委或对等的政府部门、国家监察委员会的检查。而自律的效果相对是较差的，因为制定规则的人也应该是规则的对象，这就导致自律难以发挥作用。事实上，这是所有体育组织的通病，包括大家也是有所耳闻的国际足联。称说它指的是这个国足球的国际管理机构，而中国共产党和政府的外部监督是国家反腐制度在体育领域的延伸。但他也认为遏制腐败仍然是一种事后基于任务或基于项目的手段，依赖于每隔几年进行一次检查，这只能是在腐败造成损害之后的补救措施。在中国建立永久性的体育制衡机制，那还有很长的路要走。毕竟有一个预防机制总比贪官污吏上台用钱养肥循环往复的被绳之以法要好。那值得关注的是，2014年领导高考运动反渎职督察的张华伟在2019年因受贿罪被判处了有期徒刑12年。程就认为中国体育经历了一个从繁荣周期，从2001年赢得夏季奥运会申办权开始，到2022年冬奥会闭幕式结束，中国出于政治、经济和战略的目的，在这2届奥运会上是投入巨大。而就像农民等到收获时才会算账一样，这一个经济周期的结束也是审查账单的时候。现在政治任务已经完成，那就是时候检查一下谁拿了不该拿的东西，并通过这一轮的反腐来清理干净。那考虑到这一轮中国男篮的战绩，有大量声音出来质疑姚明权势青天，自带尚方宝剑空降领导位，恐怕也不奇怪了。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯、更多内容可以关注6度简报网，网址是6度 brave.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
Your return to this place where you live, this country where you've lived for 20 years, but left early in the months of the pandemic. Most of your time living in China, until the last few years, seemed to be a time of kind of gradual opening and optimism economically and culturally, a time when the US-China relationship seemed to be improving rather than rapidly deteriorating as it is now. But that, of course, had started to shift in the years before you left. And yet you still were surprised by what you found when you returned to China after a few years away. Just talk a bit about what that experience was like. What had changed? What surprised you?
Yeah, I had different feelings. I left in early 2020, in March of 2020, as part of these tit-for-tat journalistic expulsions. The Trump administration had expelled 58 Chinese journalists, and the Chinese retaliated by expelling about 15 American journalists. And at the time, I was accredited for the New York Times. And so I left, and I was actually out of the country when I was expelled. I didn't even have a chance to pack up my apartment or say goodbye to people. So it was a bit of a weird departure. It wasn't the typical departure that one has when one's been in a place for a long time, where you have some farewell dinners and make a walk around the Forbidden City or someplace like that. So going back was also a chance to sort of close that chapter in my life, but it was also a chance to evaluate how things had changed after the COVID period, after the COVID lockdowns and the radical policies that the government had followed to control the virus. And it was also a chance for me to sort of see China in a new light, because when I was there continuously, of course, I went on vacations and stuff, but from January 1st of 2009 until March 2020, so it's a bit like being a frog in a pot of water, boiled, and you sort of it's getting hotter and hotter, but it's only when you jump out of it and then you go back in, you realize, gosh, things really are different. And so some of my feelings were based on that, and some of it were things that I think had actually changed in the intervening 3 years from 2020 to 2023. And overall, my feeling was that things had really changed a lot, not for the better, and that China was heading down essentially a dead-end path.
So to talk a bit more about the diagnosis, and we call this stagnation in the title of the piece, but that's a modification of a Chinese concept that you translate as involution. And just to quote what I thought was a really powerful line from the piece, when you're talking about economic problems in China, you note that these are, quote, part of a broader process of political ossification and ideological hardening For anyone who's observed the country closely over the past few decades, it is difficult to miss the signs of a new national stasis. So talk more about what brought you to that conclusion and what you think this means for China.
Well, going away and then returning gave me a chance to take things from a slightly broader perspective than perhaps is the case when you're living in a place. And my overall feeling is, if you think back to why Xi Jinping came to power, he was part of this turn by the party toward more control. We tend to see it all due to Xi Jinping when he took power in 2012, but in fact, the signs were already there beforehand. Susan Shirk has talked about that in her new book, Overreach. And at the time, there were signs, unmistakable signs. Social media was being closed down. Some NGOs were coming under pressure. And Xi Jinping really supercharged this. And I think his mandate was to reassert party control over a variety of things, including civil society, ideology, and the economy. And he's gone about that in a ruthless fashion, perhaps much more so than his supporters might have wished, because he's almost turned his back on most of the policies, arguably, that made China such a success story for the first 30 years of the reform period. That might be defined as 1978, roughly, until the end of the 2000s, around 2010 or something like that. And during this period, that was characterized by a lighter touch on society. Obviously, huge caveats here: Tiananmen Square, crackdown on Falun Gong, those were brutal actions, but overall, a lighter touch on people's personal lives, their daily life, and a lighter touch on the economy, and a tolerance, even a support, a broad support for private enterprise. I think he's radically changed that formula of success. He's abandoned it, left it, and that's, I think, leading to these problems.
Let's talk a bit about the economy, because that's been such a focus of analyses of China from the outside over the last several months. The story was that we anticipated was that when China ended zero COVID, as it did late last year, the economy would come roaring back. And instead, what we've seen is continued tepid growth and high youth unemployment and lots of signs that things are rot beneath the surface, even beyond what we can see. There was always a sense that that would present a kind of acute challenge to the party, and that leadership needed to maintain high economic growth to maintain their own legitimacy, to kind of sell this bargain to the Chinese people. That no longer seems to be the case. They just don't seem especially concerned by what looks like a fairly dramatic slowdown. Is that your sense as well?
I think what the party is telling itself is that this is part of a transition that we're making away from making cheap stuff and growth based on investment toward a high-tech economy that will pull us up into the ranks of the advanced nations, the rich nations. Because don't forget, even though China is an economic superpower and a military superpower, economically per capita, it's still a mid-income country. And that the government thinks this is part of a necessary transition that we have to embark on. It's going to be painful, but we're going to do things the right way. We're not going to just blindly invest in real estate and other fixed asset investments like more high-speed rail. We're going to change the formula for growth. Unfortunately, I don't think they're going about this in a way that is really going to lead to success. It's certainly not what most Chinese economists, and foreign economists for that matter, recommend or see as viable. The idea essentially that the government is going to push high tech, pick the winners, pick the sectors, that can sometimes work when you're playing catch up to other countries, when you already see who's doing what successfully, and then you say, okay, we're going to invest in those sectors. But when you're trying to become a leading nation, then it's harder to essentially copy what others are doing. So I think this is the conundrum that they face. They're trying this model, but it doesn't seem likely to succeed.
One of the things that comes through so clearly in the piece you wrote for us, but I think is true of your reporting more broadly, is that you connect with a much broader swath of people in China and go to a wider range of places in China than the standard Western analyst who might drop in for a week or two and talk to mostly other elites. In that reporting that you were doing for this piece, and more broadly, did you sense discontent, any kind of questions about the leadership of the party or Xi Jinping?
A lot of it depends on who the person's employer is. There's still many Chinese people who work for the state, who work as civil servants, who work for state-owned enterprises. And for them, things aren't that bad. They're still getting their paychecks. The government is supporting them, so they probably are even benefiting from the change in policy. And they may like Xi Jinping's foreign policy being more muscular. They may have a sort of more nationalistic bent and find that good. So those people are probably doing okay and are probably thinking the government is on the right track. People who depend on the private economy, who have anything to do with foreign investment, foreign companies, but even Chinese entrepreneurs themselves who are private, they're feeling the pinch and they are not that happy. So this isn't necessarily even just the elites who are running companies. People who are working for them notice that there are fewer foreigners. The tourism industry hurts to some degree because of that. They can sense that there's been a change and that it isn't all for the better.
To what extent did people still talk about the experience of zero COVID and especially the end of zero COVID? The lockdowns in China, of course, lasted much longer than elsewhere and were much more draconian. That worked well for a while until it didn't. And then the party lifted those very, very abruptly with little preparation. That seemed kind of staggering to watch from the outside at the time. But I'm curious to what extent, several months later, that still seemed to have kind of left a scar on the population, but also sown questions in people's mind about the wisdom of their own government.
Definitely the zero COVID policy and the abandonment of it in such a dramatic fashion, almost a reckless fashion, was the first crisis that many people experienced in their lifetimes. Or this is true, especially for young people. Say people who are in their 20s now, they've probably only known pretty good times. Even in their 30s, they've only seen growth continuing. This was a shock, I think, for a lot of people, that the government so obviously mishandled things. Early on, you could say it was harsh, but it was successful. And compared to the debacle in many foreign countries with millions of people dead and so on and so forth, it wasn't too bad. So in 2020, it made a lot of sense, zero COVID, the draconian lockdowns, at least millions of people weren't dying in China as they were in other countries. But by the second half of 2021, this really didn't make much sense anymore with better vaccines, and people began to sense this, to realize that, hey, other countries are doing it better, other countries are opening up, why aren't we opening up? And 2022 was really the worst year for Xi Jinping, probably since he took power in 2012. The lockdowns were failures. At least on a popular level, they led to huge silent protests or protests in different ways. And then the abandonment of zero COVID led to more than 1 million deaths, preventable deaths, which shocked people. I talked to a doctor who worked in an emergency ward in a county hospital where the medical system is really not that good. And he was shocked at the number of people who were coming in and who were dying in the ward. And he said, we thought this was what we were supposed to be avoiding. This is what the government said only happened in the Western countries, but here it was happening now. We didn't have a new round of vaccines for old people. We didn't even lay in antiviral medicines, which we could have done, but we didn't. It was all overnight. Even for us, we had no chance to prepare. So he was really embittered by that experience. That was in May. Now, of course, as time passes, these memories will grow fainter. But I think it was this year, it's still very much in people's minds.
The protests that, at least from the outside, seemed to prompt the end of zero COVID were, I think, fairly shocking at the time from people watching from the outside to see fairly open protests that included kind of open defiance of the party in a number of Chinese cities. But it does not seem to have, led to a sustained wave that at least we can see. What do you think we should make of it? And what do you think the takeaways for Xi Jinping and for the party more generally are?
It is sometimes easy to overestimate events that we see on the street. If you count all the protesters together, they probably numbered at the most just a few thousand. But I think that it was still extraordinary that people felt the need to protest, that this level of frustration was just so palpable and it's just so overwhelming that people took this highly unusual step. Don't forget, China is not the kind of place nowadays, at least under Xi Jinping, where there are regular street protests like this that challenge central government policies. So I think it was quite significant. I'm not sure if it directly led to the COVID policies being overturned. I think that was also due in part to the huge financial cost of zero COVID, the local governments had to spend huge amounts of money on setting up these COVID testing stations. It really kneecapped the economy. And this is one of the reasons why the economy has continued to be so slow. But the significance of it could be that rather than being an outlier, a one-off, that as the economy continues to slow and China is faced with more longer-term challenges, such as demographic challenges, that this could be a harbinger of protests and unrest in the future, because pretty much everyone agrees that the days of fast economic growth are past in China. Part of that is normal because as an economy matures, it can't grow as quickly. But that kind of a strong, robust economic growth also papered over a lot of cracks in Chinese society. Without that growth, it's going to be harder for the government to sort of keep a lid on things as they have so successfully over the past few decades.
One thing that you note in the essay is the level of youth unemployment. And I was in China in July, and struck by conversations I had with people at universities who said that graduates wanted to extend their time in school rather than entering such a terrible job market. To what extent do you think that's a source of dissatisfaction that may be significant going forward? That's a really major change for kind of elite students coming out of universities.
It's sort of striking that in a country that is facing this demographic challenge, where the population is shrinking, the number of young people is declining every year, that there's problems in finding jobs for people. That, I think, has to be considered a huge failing in Xi Jinping's economic policies. And it's not something that just came up because of zero COVID. This is the explanation that you hear from sort of pro-government or people who repeats the government line. They'll say, well, zero COVID was perhaps a little bit excessive. It did kind of hurt the economy, but give us a year or two and things will be back to normal. Rather, I think the slowdown is due to over a decade of not only a lack of pro-market reforms, but a series of anti-market reforms that have slowed the poles of growth that have been so important for China over the past 30 or 40 years.
We'll be back after a short break.
The story of the global economy is one we all write. And this October, it's time for the next chapter. Leaders from 190 countries are gathering in Marrakesh to discuss how to build a better future, greener, fairer, together. Join us in a timeless city with a new story to tell for the 2023 World Bank Group IMF annual meetings, October 9th to the 15th. Find out more at meetings.imf.org.
The essay is, of course, fascinating in its own right, but it's also particularly fascinating read alongside your new book called Sparks, which is about what you call the counter-historians in China, which suggests there are these kinds of strands of independent thought that may be kind of hard to identify and connect with for most observers from the outside. Talk about who these counter-historians are and why you saw that as such a significant dimension of modern China's experience that was worth writing a book about.
Yeah, I call them counter-historians or underground historians as a shorthand for a group of people who you could also call public intellectuals, writers, filmmakers, artists, novelists, journalists, and others who are trying to chronicle the whitewashed portions of Chinese history, the portions of history that the Communist Party does not really want people to know about, because it's, as we were talking about, it legitimizes itself partially on performance, but it also legitimizes itself based on this historical argument, which is linked to performance. That is that history brought the party to power in 1949, and its string of successes since then shows that the party deserves to stay in power going forward. And that's why you can't really have an open discussion about the many traumas that have taken place over the past 75 years, not just things from the last century like the Great Famine or the Cultural Revolution, but things like zero COVID. And the people I write about are active in all of these spheres. They also tried to chronicle what happened in Wuhan, how that outbreak took place. And these are also things that the government, this narrative it wants to control, particularly strong. It was interesting also for me to see that the people I wrote about, a couple of them came to the fore in the zero COVID protests last year as people got frustrated and they thought the government's version of reality, the story they've been telling us, is not working. It's obviously not accurate. They began to look for alternative voices, alternative ways of explaining China's past. And some of the people I wrote about were then circulated in social media and had a bit of a platform.
To the extent that there is I realize there's a great diversity of thought among the people that you write about in the book, but is there an alternate vision for China's future, for its future leadership, for governance in China? To what extent do you see a kind of incipient alternate path for the country in the work of this group?
Yeah, the subtitle is China's Underground Histories and Their Battle for the Future. So you begin to wonder, well, what is their agenda? They don't have a definite plan like, say, classic dissidents might, who have a charter or some sort of a program to replace one-party rule with multi-party rule or something like that. Rather, I think they would like to push for a more open China. There's a huge variety of visions that people have. Some have very concrete political ideals and ideas they'd like to push. Others just want to have a more tolerant government, one where the past can be discussed freely. And they do realize, of course, that by doing this, they challenge the Communist Party's legitimacy. But it's not so much a push to overthrow the CCP or something like that. It's just, let's try to get this knowledge out there and help people understand that there's more to the Communist Party than what they read in their textbooks or see in museum exhibitions or on popular TV dramas.
And to what extent are these people tolerated? I mean, these are not, for the most part, dissidents, as you say, who have been forced to flee China or been in prison. There's kind of a more complicated dynamic between them and the government and the party.
Yes, these people have one foot inside the system and one foot outside. A couple of them might be considered classic dissidents, but for example, Professor Ai, she's retired from the university, but held a position at the university as a tenured professor. There's another journalist I wrote about, Mr. Tan, and he worked for a government-run magazine. Professor Guo at Tsinghua University in Beijing also works in the sociology department there. So they do sort of normal things that normal people do, right? They own property and they raise family. They just try to do other things, travel and go on vacations and stuff like that. They're not sort of holed up in a garret with a crazy plan to overthrow the party, as sometimes one might think of dissidents being, lone wolves or people tilting at windmills. But I think all of them have paid a price and they have been marginalized. People such as Professor Ai have suffered for it. The journalist, Mr. Tan, he was never given a promotion, never allowed to do anything else, just kept it. He kept his job, but he was sort of shuffled off into the corner. And in some ways, the government does this as a way to keep an eye on you and to keep another bit of pressure that they can use on you by saying, we know where you are at least. We know where you live. You're not completely off our radar screen this way. But the government increasingly does not like what they do, especially through the 2010s after Xi Jinping took power. Their venues for expressing themselves have been shut down.
I want to shift the conversation a bit to some of the ways that this analysis intersects with the questions for U.S. policy and the U.S.-China relationship. I think one thing that I was struck by in conversations, with a much narrower range of scholars when I was in China over the summer, was how much more they think that a kind of nationalist public hems them in, that when they write something that is, not sufficiently hardline, it's not just, the occasional party authority that responds to them, but also a outpouring of anger from the kind of nationalist online crowd, and that has really changed. Do you think that that kind of level of nationalism is in fact a major factor, or is that kind of ginned up by the party to reinforce their own hardline message?
It's true that when you go on social media in China, you find a lot of nationalists talking, but this is also because other voices have been silenced. So in some ways, if the government were a bit more tolerant, then you would have some people challenging the nationalist narrative and offering up other visions. It's not that there aren't nationalists in China, and if there were free and democratic elections in China, it's quite possible that there would be an ultra-nationalist party that could come to power. However, we won't really know at all until there is a bit more of a public discussion in China that's permitted. And yet the government does not want this at all.
I was struck by more or less a consensus among everyone I spoke to that when I asked them to characterize U.S. policy towards China at this point, it was some version of, Washington is out to weaken China, to suppress China's rise, to undercut its power. Was that similar to what you heard? Did you hear more complicated views of U.S. policy in the United States, or was that a shift in the few years you were out of China?
No, that is the view certainly that many people have in China. However, my overall feeling going back, again, sort of taking the very macro view, is that China is doing more to isolate itself than the West is doing to isolate China. In some specific areas, such as technology, the United States policy now and other Western countries' policies is essentially doing what China has always done to Western countries. I mean, you could never if it was cutting edge Chinese technology, you'd never be able to get access to it. And now we're simply saying you can't have access to our cutting edge technology. But that's not really that surprising that a country would take that. Countries like the United States would take those actions, I think. Rather, what struck me was just how China is not really interested in reopening to the outside world on a vast array of things like people-to-people contacts. They don't really care about tourists coming back, foreign students coming back. I think in some ways the COVID crisis plays perfectly into the overall efforts by the government to limit foreign contacts, because they can just blame it a little bit on COVID and then sort of reset the clock, where they are quite happy to have not an isolated country. It's certainly not like, say, North Korea or anything like that, but it's no longer the country that welcomes foreign investors or foreigners really at all to go there and do stuff, unless you happen to be bringing technology or doing something completely innocuous.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by something you noted in the piece, which is just how hard it is to be a foreign visitor at this point in very kind of quotidian ways, that no one takes cash anymore. You have to have, a Chinese credit card and the right kind of apps to just kind of exist day to day, even in Beijing, which was certainly a change from, the last time I was there before the pandemic.
Yeah, going back there, I felt that it was somehow amazing in some ways how China has created this parallel universe of apps. Some of it is almost this Rube Goldberg sort of ramshackle apps and stuff like that. They don't really work as well. Going back and using all the Chinese mapping systems and that social media, their version of Wikipedia and so on and so forth. It's all, and this is very subjective, but it's kind of second rate. And there are some things that work pretty well, like WeChat and so on. But the overall idea, I think, that a lot of people have with social media, or at least with the internet as a broad concept, is that it helps link us with other people, that we can have conversations with people around the world, etc., more easily. We can connect. We can use translation software to try to understand what other people are doing. But in China, it's almost the opposite. It's like all of this stuff is being formed to isolate Chinese from the rest of the world, to make it harder and harder to interact.
Did you sense a change in views of the United States in your conversations, not so much of U.S. policy, but of U.S. power, let's say? I mean, the kind of one of the staples of Xi Jinping's rhetoric certainly was this idea that, the East is rising, the West is declining, the sense that as China's power was growing, the West was in terminal decline. That's much, I think, harder to make that case right now. But had that changed the view among a broader array of Chinese voices? What was the sense of the United States?
Overall, the feeling I got, even from people at the grassroots and working class neighborhoods and places like that, was that it was harder to be an American, to say you're an American. Of course, old friends and stuff like that, they don't care. But you would sometimes get people make some kind of a nervous joke about, oh, you're from the United States, the world's policeman, right? Something like that. And you're kind of, everyone goes, ha, 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 right. So, yeah, world's policeman, ha, ha, ha. And then, well, what about old Biden and stuff like that? You get this kind of, this overall feeling that you're coming from an enemy country, and although Chinese are extremely hospitable and there's no personal animosity at all, that it was somehow more awkward than it was before. You'd have to be get a really contrarian person who would say, oh, great, the United States, I really admire the United States, or I'm really interested in going there to travel. You got a lot more of that 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I went to China early on. But nowadays, it's more of a bit of a nervous recognition that you're from the other side.
So there's this idea that has become quite prominent in American analyses of China, which, the shorthand is peak China, this idea that China's power has peaked, its growth is not just softened, but is going to kind of go into decline. Your essay in some ways could be seen feeding into that, but I think you kind of come out in a very different place, and you have this, I think, very powerful comparison to the Berlin Wall. And you note, I'm quoting you here, the wall couldn't save the German Democratic Republic, but it bought the leadership time. Now China's rulers seem to be building and perfecting their own 21st century version of the Berlin Wall. Talk a bit about what you think that means in terms of what the next years look like for China.
I think there's maybe two things one has to keep in mind when embarking on a very pessimistic analysis of China. One is that China is still run by a very competent civil service and has a population that is hardworking and reveres education. You also have to think that some of what the government is doing may not be very productive in the long run, but it's still going to keep China in the game. And I think if you're worried about China from a military point of view, let's say, these things that are happening in China right now don't affect that equation. If you're worried about peace in the Taiwan Straits, if China doesn't grow quite as strongly as it might, it doesn't mean it won't stop building aircraft carriers and modernizing its military. It will still afford that. I do think, though, that what you see probably is a country that's more and more hobbled by the decisions it's making. That, again, when you have this supercharged economic growth, you can afford a lot of different things. When you have slower growth, problems begin to be harder to master by simply having fast economic growth. And that goes back to these counter-historians, that they are probably going to get more of a hearing and be more relevant as the country continues down this road of slower growth and with more social problems percolating up. So it's a period, probably, people often say, was it like the Soviet Union? Often when they hear this about these counter-historians, they say it's like the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the rise of groups like Memorial, which helped undermine the Soviet Union. I would say it's more like 1960s Soviet Union, when Brezhnev is still sort of at his peak and strong and hasn't yet declined. And we still have a long way to go before there's going to be any systemic crisis or change in the overall rule of China or the system that runs it.
There's another idea that I think gets pretty wide purchase in Washington, which is that a China that is struggling more on the home front, that doesn't have, kind of miraculous economic growth to make problems go away, is more likely to lash out internationally or to take risks, in its own region or globally. I think even President Biden has said this at various points. Does that strike you as the right way of thinking about it?
But I think the bigger risk is that there are many, many signs that Xi Jinping seems to be isolated. There are strange political events over the past few months, the foreign minister disappearing, the defense minister disappearing, the COVID policies, which seem to be the result of somebody who's not really listening to his advisors, the economic policies, which also seem to be running against what used to be fairly conventional wisdom in China on the need for some element of a robust private sector. So I think that he could embark on some sort of foreign adventures in a way similar to Putin, because he thinks, I can win this, or it will work in my favor, if he's being told that. I don't know how many advisors now will dare to tell him things that he doesn't want to hear. This is especially true after the last party Congress last year, when the people of his generation all retired. That left him there, surrounded by people who are basically 20 years his junior, who probably are only in these positions because he approved their promotion and so owes something to him. So they're even less likely to say, hey, you know what, this is not a good idea. We need to back off on private enterprise, or let's just put Taiwan on the back burner for another 10 years until we're in a better position. We don't know what kind of advice he'll get, but I think that it could be that he gets bad advice. And that seems to me the most likely scenario for some sort of foreign misadventure.
I want to close by getting your views on some of the questions for U.S. policymakers, informed by the, I think much more textured, richer sense of dynamics on the ground that you have that many people lack. You came back to the United States a year or two ago, I believe. It has only been a couple of years, and you probably could have written a completely different essay upon your return about the dramatic shift in the debate about China here So I'm curious what struck you about the dynamics of that debate, and especially what it gets wrong, what you think as you observe the debate about China and U.S. foreign policy circles, what makes you kind of scratch your head or causes concern on your part.
Many of the policies make a lot of sense to me, such as not wanting to sell our best technology to China. I don't really buy into the sort of fatalist, laissez-faire view that they're going to get it anyway. I think if they want to get it, then they should have to get it themselves. We don't have to give them our best stuff. So some of that I support. What I miss is a vision for how to actually live with China in the future. There doesn't seem to be any effort at restarting interest in academia for China. We need some sort of almost like a Marshall Plan to kickstart universities to send students back to China. We need to improve Chinese studies. Right now, Chinese studies is cratering. The number of people studying Chinese is going way down. There's more interest in Japan because of manga comics, or in Korea because of K-pop. I mean, seriously, this is what motivates young people, right? This is what gets you excited when you're an 18 or 19-year-old picking your major. It's not because China might be the next superpower or something. That's not going to get somebody to choose Chinese studies. We need to somehow make the case that China matters. And this is where maybe the end of my book, I have a bit of a challenge for civil society in the United States. I think we need to engage more with these really interesting people in China and invite them over to our film festivals, hold retrospectives about them, bring them over to our think tanks, get their books translated more often. There's so few of these books are translated. They're journalistic essays and so on. And have a project to sort of understand people who have another vision for China. I think sometimes we take the front page of People's Daily as the gospel truth. And the front page of People's Daily is that Xi Jinping is in charge and he's doing everything he wants and he's got complete and absolute control of the country. When you get there and look around a little bit, you see that's not exactly the case. And so we need to understand that there are other people with other ideas and then try to give them a platform in a way that they don't really have now. And in some ways, we had it in the Cold War. I don't know exactly why that was, if it was all the CIA funding secret translation projects of things, but there seemed to be a lot more novels and essays and stuff by Central and Eastern European intellectuals. Some of them were household names among educated people in the West. You don't find that among Chinese today, but those people do exist. And if you bring those kind of people over, I think you also have this synergy to firing up interest in China. You would have people who see, hey, there are interesting people in China doing amazing work. And it's a big mistake, I think, just to sort of write off China and say, nothing's going on there. It's just a totalitarian dictatorship. Forget it. Let's just sort of bar the door and keep them out. That's not going to deal with the reality we faced in the rest of the 21st century.
Before we get talking about the future of the U.S.-China relationship, we need to understand a bit about its past.
So, Evan, we've known each other for over 20 years, but I used to come and talk to you when I was a journalist based here in Washington. I remember you had a very cool office.
Yes, I had a very big office.
Did you have a Canon in your office? Am I imagining that?
That's classified.
Anyway, so you were running Asia policy day to day for the National Security Council in the Obama administration. And, you know, that's not that long ago in years, but it's like another world in US-China relations.
Another world.
If someone had come to you at that point and asked you to sum up the US-China relationship in one word or one phrase, what would you have said back then? And what would you say today?
So back then, it was this complicated mix of competition and cooperation. Now we're in a different world, right? It's long-term structural strategic competition where our interests diverge more than they converge.
And can we dig into this question? How much of foreign policy can be explained by kind of structural forces, national strength and economic growth? And how much is like the leader at the top table?
I've thought about this question a lot. I'm probably a little counter-consensus on it. I do believe that Xi Jinping really has had a unique and probably outsized influence on this transition to long-term strategic competition. When Xi Jinping came to power, I think the Chinese were hoping that they would get sort of a spicy, more competent version of Hu Jintao. A party man, but somebody that would control special interests better and be more active internationally. Hu Jintao was already moving there. I don't think most of the party that chose Xi Jinping expected that he would be as scorched earth in terms of anti-corruption, both in the military and in the civilian sector. I remember when the Chinese deployed the Air Defense Identification Zone over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the fall of 2013. I don't think the foreign ministry even knew. The PLA said, let's do it. He said, let's do it, right? That was the beginning.
There is an active debate about whether the Obama administration was slow to see the dangers of those reclaimed reefs, and maybe also was the US military slow to see the dangers of those reclaimed reefs. And then, when the US military got into a panic, did the NSC block some of the kind of freedom of navigation operations that maybe the US Navy wanted to sail?
Can I just add, we've done a Drum Tower series on China and Japan before, and when I was in Tokyo with my colleague there, we spoke to some former Japanese officials, and one thing we heard quite a lot was they felt like Japan was kind of raising the alarm about China, particularly on maritime security earlier, and that the US was a little bit slow to come around or to realize that this wasn't just a Japan-China thing, like this is really serious.
So you guys are really asking the hard questions now. So it's interesting you say that about Japan, because when the Japanese government in the summer of 2012 nationalized the Senkakus and it created a real crisis, the U.S. worked in lockstep with Japan to deter Chinese provocations. And then, of course, when Obama visited Japan in 2014, we sort of pulled out all the stops to signal that publicly, and I believe Obama was the first president to say in Japan that the islands were covered under the Mutual Defense Treaty. So, I mean, I think the fact that the Chinese were not able to undermine Japan's administration of the islands and weren't able to push the boundaries and use the nationalization move in 2012, I think is actual indication that the alliance has been working quite well. The Chinese were very, very skillful in the way they conducted land reclamation that made it hard to understand exactly what was going on. Because you got to remember, nobody had ever seen this before. It's not like there was a pattern, a fact pattern, and we could recognize the fact pattern and say, aha, we know what they're doing. They're building 7 artificial islands, 3 of which will be quasi-military bases, right? What I can tell you did not happen is nobody said, oh, we know what the Chinese are doing, but it's not a big deal because we want to cooperate on climate change. There was no kind of decision like that. So in retrospect, sure, I wish we had moved faster because the Chinese were able to accomplish something that changed the strategic situation in the South China Sea.
Do you think the Chinese read President Obama as weak?
No, I don't think they read President Obama as weak.
So why did they take the risks they took?
I mean, I think generally Chinese statecraft is about constantly exploring and pushing the boundaries. It's about trying to see what they can get away with. And I think that the PLA had really been pushing for more action in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. And the Chinese thought, okay, in the South China Sea, we can do this quickly and, we can make enough progress before the Obama administration and U.S. allies in Asia really have time to push back. The other part of it that's important to keep in mind is we live in a world today, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where there's an enormous degree of solidarity and agreement about the nature of the China challenge among the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and now newly Europe, right? And so the ability to push back and to use the tools of international coordination for pushback are a lot greater. It wasn't like that in the Obama administration.
So you're somebody who got to work on the front line of shaping the U.S.-China relationship, and now you're here at Georgetown, you're teaching students who may have a part to play in that in the future. Are there differences you already see in the students in the next generation from your engagement with them?
Well, I mean, most basically, the future generation of scholars and policymakers, most of them just have a lot more direct experience of each other.
So we're very excited to have a group of your students here, just as a kind of first marker of where we stand with this room of students. Could we just ask you to tell us whether you're basically optimistic or pessimistic about the future of US-China relations? So I'm going to ask, if you're optimistic that things could get better, could you raise your hand? I think we have one, two.
Wait, two?
So we have two hands raised. And so if you're pessimistic, okay, that is pretty much everyone else. And so some not raising their hands either way, which is...
I would say optimistic.
Optimistic, okay. So we have a third optimistic. So we have 3 out of 11 for optimism, so 8 for pessimism about the future of the relationship.
Wow. Okay, so I thought we could just start off by getting to know some of you. And we wanted to just ask, why are you studying U.S.-China relations? Is it because of your personal connections to it? Or is it for some other reason? What do you plan to do with your studies?
Hi, my name is Laura Edwards. And I spent most of my childhood living in China. My family moved there when I was 6 years old, and I stayed through my first year of college. So for me, I was always interested in everything China, Chinese history, politics. And I think for me, U.S.-China politics now has become this very contentious issue, but for me personally, it's very connected to sort of these early childhood experiences that I had growing up there, having Chinese friends, going over to their houses during Chinese New Year and making dumplings. I do feel quite pessimistic about the future. It seems like we're in a really tough place where I don't see either side willing to make room in ways that would allow the relationship to improve in a significant way. So that's why I feel a bit negative in the relationship, even though I will likely be building my career around U.S.-China policy.
Hi, my name is Meng Jian. I'm from China. I was studying literature, and the reason that I wanted to study U.S.-China relation is because of one novel that I read. It is a classical Chinese novel. I was reading the first version of English translation of it, The Journey to the West, translated by Timothy Richard. But the novel was originally a mix of Buddhist and Taoist culture, but Timothy Richard's translation completely transformed it into, like a Christianity teaching. And yeah, that really surprised me, and that gave me the feeling that at least culturally the misperception between US-China must be really, severe and deep. And after I come here, I started to feel like not only culturally, but probably in all areas, the misperception and distrust and the reinterpretation of China's intentions are sometimes misperceived.
A lot of you guys are cross-cultural, like you've grown up or lived between the US and China or Taiwan or other parts of Asia. And I wanted to know kind of what do you think is the biggest perception gap between the two sides?
Hello, my name is Tristan Murdoch, and I first went to China in 2016 with the National Security Language Initiatives for Youth while I was in high school. I'm also from Wyoming, which is extremely conservative. And I remember most of what I knew about China was pretty negative. And I remember talking to my local coordinator who was helping me get all my documents together, and he just couldn't believe it. He would say, "You're going to communist China, wow, communist China." And I remember thinking, oh boy, what have I signed up for? And I went and I stayed with a host family for 10 months. I had a really, really positive experience while I was there. I learned to speak Chinese as well as, you can in 10 months. And maybe that's a product of where I grew up, but there was just a big chasm of misunderstanding between how Americans thought of China and how Chinese people think of Americans as sort of the other.
Hi, my name's Erilyn. I'm from Beijing, born and raised. I did IR in undergrad in California, and we talked a lot about Belt and Road Initiative. And most of the materials we covered were basically saying that how it is economic coercion on the negative side. But from like friends and family or just people back home, they generally view that as something to be proud of, to be able to give back to the international community. I am generally really optimistic about the future of US-China relations, especially from my own perspective as a master's student. I think our program created a really safe space to have conversations on potentially sensitive issues that would otherwise be contentious.
You mentioned something that I kind of wanted to expand as a question to everyone else. How easy is it for you guys to talk to each other about US-China relations? Like, is there going to be a war over Taiwan? Do you feel that you're able to have open conversations about that with each other?
Hi, my name is Claire Chow, and I'm from Taiwan. I also came from a Taiwanese military family. My dad is still in the military, and so that really affects how I perceive cross-strait relations. In college, for example, like I was in a US-China relations course, and it was mostly Chinese international students where they would be very dismissive about like Taiwan and any view of US for Taiwan, and I think that affected a lot on my like college experience, and that's why I ended up like graduating a year and a half early, because I didn't really like the academic environment there. And so I think it largely depends, and I think Georgetown does have a really safe space for that, but that would, I guess, largely depend on the school and whether you have a healthy environment within classrooms.
It also depends on, what courses are you in and what academic environment that course provides you with. For example, if you're in a course where the tone is already settled, like the professor is really prone that China is seeking to replace the United States as the global hegemon, it would be really hard to, defend that or to have a debate on whether China's intention is that.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? So it's really striking how, if you listen to some American politicians, when they talk about Chinese students studying in America, they kind of set conditions. What would be a good Chinese student? So a good Chinese student is one who's not kind of an agent for the Communist Party, that they're kind of open to Western ideas. You are welcome if you kind of meet these conditions. Flip it round to listening to Chinese government officials, and to be a good Chinese student overseas, make sure you kind of love the motherland, uphold Chinese values. Do you feel a pressure as a Chinese student studying in America to be either an American leader's view of what's a good Chinese student or a Chinese official's view of what's a good Chinese student? Is there some extra burden placed on you?
No, that's not a burden on me because because I don't take those requirements into me. I think to do good academic studies is to deprive myself of my original biases, to be able to look into those issues through various people's perspectives. Having been raised in China for 20 years and having a family where most of the culture and educations, it's really hard for me to just abandon all of that. Certainly, I have personal standings on a lot of issues, but I don't think that I should bring them into a lot of those academic studies or to, become somebody's good student. I want to just be comfortable on myself. And I think doing that would automatically, most times fulfill what my family would expect of me or what the US's academic environment want of me as a scholar or student.
Can I just to ask anyone from China here, I guess, and this is a hard question, you don't have to answer it if it's not comfortable, but I remember talking to a professor from a different university who said that his grad students from the mainland would often say to him in private, can you make sure that I'm not in a class with any other mainland student? Because if there are other mainland students, I'm frightened they're going to report me to the Chinese embassy and I'll be in trouble and the police will visit my parents back home. So does that resonate with any of you here, that kind of sense of being scrutinized and judged?
I think it's not in a being surveillanced sense. When I first got to America to study IR in my undergrad college, and China got mentioned a lot in just any of my classes. And at first, it can be a little bit triggering because I somehow felt like when people criticize China, they were coming at me. But after a while, having like detaching myself from the factual issues that we're talking about makes it much easier for me as a PRC citizen to have academic conversations, fact-based, without personal emotions or nationalism attached. So that's what I'm striving for, and I would like to keep it that way. So I try not to think of myself as being surveillanced or as speaking for certain countries, or like in that sense.
Thank you, Ellen. You know, going back to some of the things that you've been talking about already, about the power and the value of people-to-people relationships, the power of these kind of exchanges. Could we fix the whole US-China relationship if we had like millions of students in China and America in both directions? Or are the problems just larger? Is it kind of vital and necessary, but not enough?
I mean, the broader structural forces are like a tidal wave that's growing in this relationship, right? We compete on security issues, economic issues, technology issues, and ideas of domestic and global governance, right? The sources of ballast in the relationship, like people-to-people ties, are very minimal. They're grains of sand. Sorry, I just totally mixed metaphors.
No, grains of sand in a tidal wave. I can see that.
Yeah, I guess.
You don't get far with a grain of sand in a tidal wave.
I guess they're grains of sand that get washed away by the tidal wave, right? And in both countries, you have these changing domestic political forces that are shrinking space for dialogue, cooperation, a stable relationship, and increasing the impulse toward seeing the other as a long-term adversary and all the competitive forces. Right? And I think we're going to see this very likely play out in the American election next year.
Evan, thank you.
I'm Howard. I'm from the Republic of China, Taiwan. I'm going to offer an even more pessimistic view on U.S.-China relations, even with student-to-student exchange. To what extent do we need U.S. decision makers to be mainland educated and mainland decision makers to be American educated? We already have that. In the 19th Politburo, we already have Wang Huning, Liu He, Yang Jiechi, and Chen Xi being foreign educated in the United Kingdom, Europe, and also in the United States. So probably unless we have two whole sets of government, one on the Washington side, one on the Beijing side, one being all mainland educated Americans and one being all America educated mainlanders, that we will have enough of a counter structure to counter the ongoing structure that we are experiencing right now.
I think that one of the biggest impediments to people-to-people exchanges is actually, in my experience, it's never been easier to travel abroad and not experience a different culture or to not learn a language. With how globalized everything is, it could have been so easy for me to go to China, in NYU Shanghai, only speak with my American friends, only go out with them, only interact with them, and very, very rarely did I need to do anything outside of that bubble. And I feel like the only way to really bridge that is to want to do that.
So tell us what your sense is of your generation in your home country, whether you're Chinese or American or from somewhere else, because there are a lot of very loud nationalist voices on the Chinese side. America also feels like a
dystopia, but at the same time, you also have Chinese youth wanting to lie flat, and then you have quiet quitting on the US side. So how would you describe the vibe of your generation in your country? Basically, do younger people also have an appetite for that kind of competition, or do you just need to wait for this older generation to age out? And then when your generation takes over, like, we'll all be able to get along.
So I think the vibe that I'm getting, especially from the Taiwan perspective, I think a lot of my friends, they're particularly in the conscription system and how they view the conscription system. I think they don't view it
military service.
Right. Yes. They don't view it as seriously, and they try to just get out of it, whether it's, being overweight, being underweight, injuring themselves. We need these Taiwanese young people to actually be more proactive in Taiwan's defense in order to actually kind of deter China.
Hi, I'm Robin. I'm from North Carolina, and I am a first-generation Chinese American. I have a hard time generalizing American youth. U.S. youth, like Chinese youth, like all youth, are chronically online. I'm also, guilty of that. Something that's really popular on TikTok, as well as YouTube, is like Li Ziqi and those cottagecore YouTubers and TikTokers in China. It's just set to Chinese music, and it's a lot of very romantically done videos of people living their lives in the countryside. It's just like very aesthetically pleasing and beautiful and not overtly political. And I think that kind of feeds into the broader wave of just content that is aesthetically pleasing and harkens back to a rural way of life.
She's like a dreamy village girl who's just chopping eggplants and cooking them for her grandma. It's very relaxing to watch.
And I think it's kind of a openness to what is going on in China, and not even on a political level. Like a lot of my peers, especially back in North Carolina, aren't focusing on international relations. I think the second part is just speaking to my own Chinese American identity. I think I've been very lucky that the US is so culturally diverse, and that, not to be like super optimistic, but it's this kind of cultural diversity and contact that I think makes general American youth, which is one of the most diverse generations in the United States in a long time, I think ever, makes it so that the temperature doesn't have to be as hot as Washington or policymakers might think it should be.
I'm on Chinese social medias, probably too much, but you see in the comment section, there's obviously like the Xiao Fenhong being very nationalistic, trying to stroke nationalism and being quite extreme. But you also see pushbacks in these comment sections where people with actual overseas experience share their own perspective and not just like simply concurring with these nationalistic sentiments.
Maybe it's nice to have respect and interest in each other's cultural differences, but we're in a competition now because China versus America is two models, and each is fairly confident that their model is kind of better. Do you think that framing of a great power competition of two models, and one is going to kind of win out because they are starkly incompatible visions of how to run the world, does that framing also make sense to you and your generation? Or your cultural diversity is also kind of openness to maybe there's good things about the other side's political model, and it doesn't have to be that kind of a zero-sum competition?
Hi, I'm Bernice. I am a Chinese American, and I hope to one day work on China policy in the U.S. government. For me personally, I've seen both sides. I understand that there's so much hardened mistrust and misperceptions there, but at the end of the day, I think the U.S. needs to work with China on certain issues, and I think we also need to compete with China on certain issues. I think that when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, the U.S. and China could have done a lot better working together, and there's also a host of other issues like climate change that we need to work together. So I don't have the right answer for it right now, but I think that we should add nuance to this framing of great power competition.
We actually wanted to ask you guys for your views on Taiwan. And Taiwan is not just a symbol, of course, but it's the potential flashpoint, right, for a U.S.-China conflict. What would your recommendations be, actually, I don't know, for the U.S. government, for China, for Taiwan, on how to prevent conflict and preserve Taiwan's democratic system at the same time? What do you think should be done? And I guess in particular, if there's anything different from what's being done right now. It's a big question. I'm sure Howard has an answer.
I worked in Taipei for KMT's Department of International Affairs during 2019, 2020, a little bit of 2021. So I think, first of all, we have to outlive Xi Jinping. He's assertive, he's aggressive, he's ambitious. We know that. And of course, we cannot make the assumption that the successor of Xi Jinping will be a lot better than Xi Jinping. But we need to outlive Xi Jinping for an opportunity for change. And in order to outlive Xi Jinping, we first need to stack up our defenses. That's the most important thing. We need to make sure that whenever the PLA is considering invading Taiwan, it is calculating their costs and benefits of a Taiwan invasion. They are deterred by the cost of it. But second, we have to do what the American government is doing right now. We need to ensure that there is an effective communication channel between Taipei and Beijing. Well, probably also, Washington and Beijing, that's very important. Manage risk and to respond to miscommunication and incidents. If we can get, of course, not millions, but like platoon level of ROC servicemen to the United States for education and vice versa. And we can create a concrete American military culture within a class of ROC military. We can change things. We can boost up our defense. We can increase our interoperability. And I think that's the way forward.
I think that it's not helpful when President Biden has made repeated statements saying that the U.S. will certainly come to the defense of Taiwan, that we will send boots on the ground. So I think the U.S. should go back to our one China policy.
I've been doing a bunch of interviews this week with senior Biden administration officials, with members of Congress, with senators. One of the things that someone said in an interview in the administration was that they had members of Congress saying to them, help me explain to my voters why Taiwan matters, because it's a very hard kind of argument to make. In America, among your own kind of friends and contemporaries and family and schoolmates, do you think there is a sort of an understanding that America might have to fight for Taiwan, or that the US-China relationship really could be, a Cold War, even a hot war? How broadly is that shared?
Wars frequently are won with hearts and minds. The War on Terror began with a lot of enthusiasm, but later was seen as a policy disaster because, in part, U.S. lost confidence in policymakers as well as policymakers' own blunders. A big reason why the U.S. is supporting Ukraine in the conflict with Russia is because of the implications that Russia's conquest of Ukraine, whether in whole or in part, would have on the rules-based international order are profound. Certainly, the context is different in Taiwan, but similarly in Taiwan, if there was a cross-strait conflict, Taiwan representing one of Asia's most robust democracies, that conflict would be a threat to democratic values in the Asia-Pacific writ large. And I think that's something that still resonates with the American people. So a kind of values-based argument needs to be made with the American public. Beyond strategy, that kind of hearts and minds argument is what can really resonate with people who aren't necessarily in DC.
We're discussing the possibility there could be a war between the US and China over Taiwan. Something must come up in your studies. How does that work for you as a Chinese mainland student?
I understand the strategic importance of the Taiwan Strait, but personally, I see Taiwanese people as brethren. And I feel like what I'm concerned for the most part is, as a Chinese citizen, if there were to be an international war, or like potentially World War III, how that would translate for me personally and for the Chinese people on an individual level. Because I feel like a lot of the times we forget that we're talking about actual living people instead of just a war game simulation. As we've seen with the Ukraine and Russian war, the cost of living shooting sky high. And if we have another war in the Taiwan Strait, then how would that look like for just average people?
Do you think there's anything like Chinese people could do to prevent a war?
The Chinese people could do?
Yeah, like ordinary people.
Like, what do you mean ordinary people?
Kind of like, how, Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And I guess if there was a war, we talk a lot about the scenario where China would be the aggressor invading Taiwan. Do you feel like ordinary Chinese people have any say in whether something like that happens, or is it like that would be something totally out of most people's control? The government makes that decision and Chinese people will just try to survive.
I feel like most governmental behaviors are out of the control of the ordinary people. Like, sure, people are represented, but I wouldn't say anyone as a ordinary individual can inflict great influence on any of the broader structural behaviors.
So, Evan, I remember coming to see you when you were in government, and I asked...
I actually let you in the White House, David. Hey, you asked me if the Chinese thought Obama was weak, so...
I didn't ask you if you thought he was weak. I didn't say I thought he was weak, but yeah.
That's a fair question.
It's a fair question. So I remember coming to see you when you were still in government, and I asked you, how does this end well? What is the best case scenario for US-China relations?
What did I say back then?
It was basically a variation on they stumble, that they make a bunch of policy mistakes and they end up being less assertive, and a somewhat more kind of self-reflective China proved somewhat more amenable to an America that had not declined as China seemed to expect. And I have to say that was basically a remarkable consensus among the people I asked that question of in DC at that time. It was the consensus argument. You're now several years out of government, several years into being full-time professor here at Georgetown, and you have not just the passage of time, but also contact with these amazingly thoughtful, reflective young people. Has your thinking changed? How does this end well?
My answer to the question has evolved, largely because the world has changed, right? And so while I continue to believe that they stumble, some combination of the economy slowing down more than they expected, challenges achieving technological innovation, continued constraints on politics. But the other part of the equation that events in the last several years have sensitized me to are not just domestic constraints, but external restraints. There's a lot more coordination on China between the US and Europe, right? NATO has a new mission. US allies and partners in Asia, Japan, Korea, and Australia in particular, are much more focused on the China challenge and willing to work with each other, with the United States. I think the biggest strategic cost to China of its alignment with Russia is the Russian invasion of Ukraine effectively globalized the Taiwan issue. Everybody's asking, is Taiwan next? But of course, final point is then there's this whole group of middle powers. You know, people talk about the global south. And where do they sit in this emerging redistribution of power? And that remains an open question. But I do think the external restraints piece is going to be important and a central part of the story of whether or not China is going to be able to achieve all of its ambitions.
And to bring that back to this room of really impressive young people who've been incredibly kind of candid with us, part of what you're talking about is a kind of just a greater global clarity about what is going on.
Awareness and clarity.
And do you see that awareness and clarity reflected in the students that you're teaching? Do you feel that this is a generation that are actually passionate about international communication and people-to-people exchanges, but not in any way kind of naive about the world we live in?
Undoubtedly.
David, the students have left and it was a great evening. What did you think of the conversation?
I mean, I guess on balance, to me, it was pretty sobering. I mean, these dozen kids, they are like bridge builders, right? They are as committed to mutual understanding between China and America as you get. But even they were really clear that they're just larger forces at work.
Yeah, I have to say I was surprised at how honest and vulnerable the students were willing to be at some points, talking about very political, sensitive subjects. But yeah, as you say, they were quite realistic about how they're just individuals and they may not be able to change the direction that things are going. At the same time, I think what stuck with me was one thing one of the students said about outliving Xi Jinping and this idea that this generation is going to outlive the people in charge right now and they will have a chance to take the relationship in a different direction.